Everyone needs this lens in their kit, regardless if you're a food, street or portrait photographer. Why? That's because this focal length closely resembles the human eye and how it views the world. And side note, this lens is really fast. I'm sure by the title of this video, you know what we're going to be talking about today, so let's just jump straight to the point. Hey, how's it going guys? Welcome back to another Tech 360 review with your host Ryan, and today we are taking a look at the Sony f1.4 G Master lens that just released. And I've had this lens for about 2 weeks now, just taking it around, shooting some night photography, shooting a little bit of my plants here and there, and I even got to interview my friend with this lens. So we'll take a look at how this lens does in terms of its bokeh and how sharp it really is. And just a side note, this lens is extremely sharp, and also the bokeh is just also creamy. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the design aspects of this lens. Alright, so let's talk design. This lens is actually not exactly very complex. I would say there are a lot of similarities with the newer Sony G Master lenses, like your manual aperture rings. All the focus hole buttons, you only have 2 on this lens, but I assure you it's more than enough. Also, what do you have? You have your click on and off for your manual aperture lens, and if you guys are interested to know more about these features, check out my other Sony lens reviews, because I'm just going to skim through the facts real quick since it's really similar to all the other lenses that I've reviewed recently. And you also obviously have your autofocus and manual focus switch, and yeah, that is about it for the exterior of this lens. So this lens has a 67mm filter thread, which is not too big, not too small, kind of fits right in the middle. However, I do have to say most of my lenses in my kit are around 77 to 82mm. So if you're intending on getting this lens and you want to use your ND filters and stuff like that, make sure you have the step-up rings necessary for you to use your filters with this lens. But apart from that, this lens is also weather and dust resistant, so you can take it out in the rain to shoot. And it is 516 grams. It's quite small, it fits nicely into my hand, and I haven't had any issues with it shooting with the A7R5 which Sony sent to me. And yeah, overall I would say like simple lens, nothing really much to talk about unless we look a little bit under the hood. So this lens has 11 aperture blades. That is quite a lot for a lens, and the more aperture blades, that would translate to your bokeh becoming more circular and more creamy, which this lens definitely has. And apart from that, 2 XD linear motors, which I would say it's really quiet. I haven't had any issues with it, you know, shooting video and photography. When it's focusing, the breathing, it doesn't really breathe that much. I mean, it's fast. It does have a little bit of focus breathing, and if you have cameras that can sort of cancel that within the camera menu system, which the A7R5 can do, you can also turn that on. But apart from that, if you're doing videos with this and you're looking to get this lens for like anything outside of photography, this lens is really quiet and I haven't had any issues with it. Focusing wise, it was really quick, and I would safely say if I remember correctly, actually all of my photos that I shot with this lens were 100% locked onto the focus, and I had no issues with it breathing or like hunting. But that's also because I've been using the A7R5, which just released. So best of both worlds. So what else do we have? Now let's take a look at the real world performance and how this lens stands up against whatever that I've shot. And bokeh, everyone loves bokeh. Who doesn't? Let me know. But at f1.4, you'll be expecting very shallow depth of field and also really creamy bokeh. How creamy? You can take a look at some of the shots that I've taken. I shot this lens with the Sony A7R5, which I've mentioned. So the Sony A7R5 has 60 megapixels, which I feel is the best camera to test out with this lens because it is extremely sharp. So at the wide open at f1.4, the thing that I noticed most about this lens when it comes to its bokeh is that the color roll-off is really smooth. If you take a look at the color differences between the different edges, for example, like one of my plants to the background, you can see that the leaves actually roll off really nicely. There's no weird like discoloration between the edges, and overall I would say this lens is really great for its bokeh. And also obviously because of its 11 aperture blades that I've mentioned just now, the bokeh balls are really smooth. You don't get, you know, weird hexagonal shapes like some of the other lenses that has less number of aperture blades, but this lens has 11, so you're going to get that round and creamy bokeh when you're shooting against like street lamps and stuff like that, which I really do enjoy. And did I also mention that because of the two extreme aspherical lens elements within this lens. Supposedly, Sony has claimed that it will have less chromatic aberration as well as a nicer overall image, which we'll take a look in a bit. But I guess, it's safe to say that even at wide open, we don't really get a lot of chromatic aberration with this lens. However, I did notice something interesting. So I took this lens out to shoot some night photos on the streets and stuff like that. And for this particular photo, if you zoom in right onto the street lamps, I did notice a slight green tint at the edges of the street lamps. But I guess this could also be due to how these street lamps are maybe they're not clean and stuff like that. Because when I'm shooting indoors and shooting my plants, I didn't really notice anything like that, and this was the only instance that I've noticed. In another shot down the street as well, the street lamps actually came off a little bit bluish, like the chromatic aberration, but honestly it is very minimal compared to the overall image. And if you don't really mind that, I guess I wouldn't say this really is an issue, because the one thing that I would say sets apart from a well-constructed lens as compared to a cheaper made lens is the chromatic aberration. I don't have an example right now, but if you look up on Google and just type chromatic aberration, you can see in some other lenses it's really obvious. Sometimes, most of the time, you will get this really weird magenta and yellow looking chromatic aberration on the edges, especially when you're shooting against lights or when you're shooting in a very heavy bokeh setting, like wide open. So this lens, wide open, if you're looking at the overall image, the chromatic aberration really doesn't come off. So I would say that it's not really an issue. So talking about the sharpness of this lens, so how sharp is it exactly? I placed a bunch of stuff on my studio's kitchen island just to test the aperture, the differences, and to see how different it is from f1.4 all the way up to f16. And I did realize some interesting things. So at f1.4, obviously the bokeh and everything is really nice and creamy. There's nice color roll off. The center of the image of my plant is actually really sharp if you zoom in all the way up to the center of the leaf, which my focus was on. However, I would say that the sweet spot of this lens is around f4 to 5.6, which will have the maximum sharpness in terms of where you're trying to focus on. But anything past f8, you start to actually lose a little bit of sharpness in the leaf, as you can see in the video right now. And the thing is, if you push it up all the way to f16, it actually is the softest I feel. And for this experiment or this test, what I did was I placed my camera on a tripod. The lighting and setting were exactly the same. I shot the photos on aperture priority, so the camera would just change my shutter speed due to the apertures just to get the overall same exposure. And also, I didn't touch the camera. I set it on a 2-second delay, so there was really no issues in terms of external factors that would cause the image to be a little bit less sharp. So no camera shake, nothing. Lighting setup is exactly the same. But if you put the f1.4 image to the f16 image and you zoom in all the way to the leaf in the center, you do notice that the f16 photo is slightly not as sharp as f1.4 or even at f4. And another thing I noticed is that when you're shooting at a higher f-stop, when you're closing down, you start to lose a little bit of the contrast. So in this image, if you notice the little pot of the leaf, you can compare the both images. In the f1.4 image, it is slightly more contrast, which I definitely prefer. And in the f16, it's actually, for some reason, it's not as contrasty. But to be fair, if you're looking at the whole overall image, it still looks extremely sharp. And this is just something that I feel that I should point out, which I don't necessarily think is something that would affect anyone in determining whether they want to purchase this lens or not. So in the 2 weeks that I had this lens, obviously I wanted to test out shooting other stuff as well. So I set it up, in one of these instances, I set it up with my strobe. So I was using it to try to get the best, cleanest and most absolute nice image of my plants. And I was really surprised when I brought the images into editing, because when I zoomed in, obviously I kind of misted my plants before that, but if you take a look at the close-ups of these images, it's extremely sharp to the point where even within the water droplets, you can just see the details of the leaf, and where it focused on, it's almost as if I could see the leaf photosynthesizing. So honestly, apart from all the talk about f16 being slightly less sharp and stuff like that, honestly I feel that this lens does perform really well, exceptionally well for a prime lens as compared to some of the other lenses that I've used out there. But I would say if you're thinking of purchasing this lens, definitely do try it out for yourself and see if the differences within the f-stops and the sharpness does make a difference to you. But honestly, shoot the photos and then bring it into your computer or laptop and then make your decision from there. Because on your little tiny screen, for example on my A7R5, even though it has like one of the sharpest screens ever, it is really difficult to tell the differences between the different f-stops. So this is just something that I would recommend to any of you that is interested in trying out this lens. Alright, so overall, my summary and personal opinion of this lens. So I guess by now you guys can already get a sense of like how I view towards Sony products. I have tested a lot of their recent products and I feel like Sony has been really at the top of their game, releasing new lenses and cameras every other month. And well, maybe I should talk a little bit about how I would use this lens if I actually had it. So if you're a photographer or videographer, a 50mm is definitely a must. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, it is because the human eye and how we view things is closely related to how the 50mm is. So if you're doing like anything related to portrait photography or street photography that you want to relate to your viewers, definitely do try to use a 50mm. And because this is a prime, so you're expecting a lot more sharpness out of it as compared to a zoom lens. And the other benefit is that normally prime lenses definitely have a wider aperture and you get more bokeh, because who doesn't love bokeh, right? As of the release of this video, I do not have any price or availability yet. I have reached out to Sony and they told me that as of this moment, there isn't any price to it yet or when it's going to be available, but do definitely check out Sony's website as I'm sure they'll be releasing it soon enough. And I do want to mention that even though I've been doing a lot of reviews for Sony and stuff like that, I am not sponsored by them. I'm not being paid by anyone to do these reviews or to talk about these lenses, and these opinions that I have is my personal opinion and definitely the truest that I can share with all of you viewers out there. So apart from just taking photos and stuff like that, I also had the opportunity to use this lens to interview a friend of mine in his garden. And I have to say, this lens, for some reason, it does really nicely when you have nice sunlight and when you have like a lot of interesting foliage in the background. So if you're a plant photographer like me, definitely do check this lens out. But I would say apart from that, I did enjoy my time with the Sony lens, and I look forward to everything else that Sony is releasing in the near future. And I'm sure you guys will be seeing me around more often than not and in the next following videos. But as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this Ryan Mamba's perspective, and even though this is a short review, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.